All right, so let's dive into something I think we've all wrestled with at some point. Those days when motivation decides it's going to take a little detour, you know? The
Uh,
feeling, right? Your to-do list is like right there in your face, and you're like, I just want to stare at the ceiling.
the classic motivation drain.
Exactly. And instead of just like throwing in the towel, we're going to kind of dissect this blog post
Yeah.
that promises to help us make those low motivation days surprisingly productive. It's called How to Get Things Done on a Low Motivation Day. Kind of a catchy title, but does it live up to the hype? We're about to find out.
A bold claim indeed.
So first up, the author spends a good chunk of time just normalizing low motivation. It's like, hey, it's okay to feel this way. You're not a robot,
Hmm.
you know? Do you think that's just coddling, or is there value in that reassurance?
Oh, I think there's tremendous value in the initial validation. So much of our internal struggle comes from resisting these natural energy ebbs and flows. And by simply acknowledging that low motivation days are part of the human experience, we can shift from self-judgment to a more proactive approach.
Yeah, I can see that instead of like beating ourselves up for not being superhuman, we can start looking for strategies that actually like work within those limitations.
Precisely. The blog post also touches on the dangers of negative self-talk. You know those "I'm so lazy" or "what's wrong with me" spirals. And instead encourages us to reframe those thoughts with something like, okay, my energy is low today, so I'll adjust accordingly. It's subtle but powerful.
Okay, but I have a confession. On my low motivation days, my go-to move is usually like a Netflix marathon or getting lost in the depths of social media. Is that really so bad? I mean, my brain feels like it's getting stimulation at least.
It's a tempting trap, isn't it? And while it might feel stimulating in the moment, that kind of passive consumption can actually further deplete your motivation. It's like junk food for the mind provides a quick hit of dopamine, but leaves you feeling sluggish and even more drained afterward.
Oh, so it's a vicious cycle then. The more I try to escape that low motivation feeling with passive entertainment, the worse it actually gets.
Exactly. The blog post calls this the overconsumption trap and suggests some concrete ways to break free. It's about setting boundaries like no screens before noon or social media detox on weekends.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those times when you're kind of stuck in that low motivation rut
Yeah.
and you need a quick pick-me-up that isn't just more mindless scrolling? Any suggestions?
The blog recommends having a pre-made list of engaging but low-effort activities ready for these moments. Things you genuinely enjoy but don't require a ton of mental bandwidth.
Oh, I like that. It's like having an emergency kit for your motivation. What kind of things would you put on that list?
It's highly personal, of course. But think about things like listening to a favorite podcast, reading a few chapters of a lighthearted book, spending time in nature, or even tackling a small creative project you've been putting off.
Okay, that's starting to sound a bit more doable. So instead of beating myself up for not tackling my entire to-do list on a low motivation day, I can still accomplish something meaningful even if it's on a smaller scale.
Absolutely. And this ties nicely with the blog's next point, which is all about building momentum with small wins. It's about shifting your focus from what you're not doing to what you can accomplish, even with limited energy.
Right. I can see that. But sometimes even those small tasks feel like insurmountable when motivation is low. Is there a way to make even those feel less daunting?
The blog post recommends a strategy they call strategic task breakdown. It's about taking a larger task and breaking it down into smaller, more manageable steps. For example, instead of clean the entire house, try tidy up the kitchen counters. Or instead of write a blog post, try jot down 5 bullet points.
So it's about like tricking my brain into thinking it's not doing as much work.
In a way, yes. By reducing the perceived effort required, you lower the barrier to entry and make it easier to get started even when you're not feeling particularly driven. And once you start taking action, even in small ways, you often find that momentum builds naturally.
That makes sense. It's like that old saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But what about those tasks that can't really be broken down, like writing an important email, for example?
That's where the blog's concept of embracing the first draft comes in. It's about shifting your focus from perfection to progress. Instead of agonizing over every word, just focus on getting your thoughts down on paper, even if they're messy and unpolished.
So it's about giving myself permission to be imperfect. I can get behind that. But doesn't that just create more work for me later?
Not necessarily. Often that initial first draft is enough to get the creative juices flowing and break through any mental blocks you might be experiencing. And even if it needs some refining later, you've already laid the groundwork, making the task feel much less daunting.
Okay, that's a strategy I can definitely try. But let's be realistic. Some days are just hard. No matter how much we try to reframe or break things down, What do we do when even the smallest task feels like climbing Mount Everest?
That's where the idea of setting your future self up for success comes into play. It's about anticipating those low motivation days and putting things in place to make them a little easier.
So it's like prepping for a hurricane, but for my motivation levels.
Exactly. Think about it like this. On your high energy days, you're like a superhero capable of anything. But on your low energy days, you're more like a mere mortal just trying to get through the day. So the idea is to use your superhero days to set your mortal self up for success.
Okay, I'm loving this analogy. So what does that look like in practical terms?
It can be as simple as laying out your workout clothes the night before prepping your work bag, or even just deciding what you'll have for breakfast. By removing those small decision points and potential obstacles, you make it easier for your future self to follow through, even when motivation is running low.
It's like paving the path for your future self so they don't stumble in the dark. I can see how that would make a huge difference.
Exactly. It's about being proactive rather than reactive and anticipating those potential pitfalls before they arise.
This is already making me rethink my whole approach to low motivation days. It's less about battling them and more about working with them. But we've covered a lot of ground already, and I feel like we're just getting started.
You're right. We've only just scratched the surface of this insightful blog post. There's still so much to unpack, and I'm eager to delve deeper into these strategies.
Well, I'm glad you're up for it because we're about to get even more strategic. We'll be right back after a short break to continue our deep dive into conquering low motivation days. And we are back. And I am still kind of buzzing about this idea of setting our future selves up for success. It's so simple, yet so brilliant.
It's a game changer for sure. But what's even more fascinating is how this concept ties into like a deeper level of self-awareness. It's almost like acknowledging that we have multiple selves operating within us.
Wait, multiple selves. Explain that one to me.
Think about it. The you who makes ambitious plans on a Sunday night is often a very different you than the one who drags themselves out of bed on a Wednesday morning.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. It's like my weekend self is all gung-ho signing me up for 6 a.m. yoga and elaborate meal prep, while my weekday self is hitting the snooze button and ordering takeout.
Exactly. And by recognizing these different versions of ourselves, we can start to anticipate their needs and set them up for success. It's like a negotiation between your present self and your future self.
So it's less about forcing myself to be consistently motivated and more about recognizing that my energy and willpower fluctuate and planning accordingly.
That's a great way to put it. It's about working with those fluctuations, not against them. And this brings us to another powerful strategy the blog post highlights: proactively planning for those inevitable low motivation days.
So instead of just hoping for the best, we should actually schedule those low energy days into our week.
Yeah.
I've never thought about it that way before.
It might sound counterintuitive, but it can be incredibly effective. By acknowledging that these days will happen, we can take steps to make them more productive, or at least less disruptive to our overall goals.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does that look like in practice?
The blog suggests creating a specific to-do list tailored for low motivation days. It's like having a backup plan for your energy levels.
So what kind of tasks should be on this special low motivation list?
Think about things that are relatively low effort but still contribute to your overall goals. For someone focused on their career, it might be catching up on industry news, organizing their workspace, or brainstorming ideas for future projects.
And for someone more focused on personal growth, what would their low motivation day look like?
It could involve decluttering their living space, listening to an inspiring podcast, or spending time journaling and reflecting. The key is to choose activities that nourish your mind, body, or spirit without requiring a ton of mental or physical energy.
You know, as we're talking, I'm realizing that this whole concept of planning for low motivation days actually aligns beautifully with the idea of self-care.
Absolutely. By acknowledging our limitations and giving ourselves permission to have those low energy days, we're actually practicing a form of radical self-acceptance.
It's like saying, hey, it's okay to not be on all the time. Even superheroes need a break sometimes.
That's a perfect analogy, and it's a message that's often lost in our culture of constant productivity and achievement.
Okay, but here's a thought. Isn't planning for low motivation days a bit like admitting defeat? Like, shouldn't we be striving to be motivated all the time?
That's a great question, and it goes back to the idea of self-awareness and working with our natural energy cycles. We all have peaks and valleys in our motivation levels. Trying to force ourselves to be constantly on is not only unsustainable, but it can also lead to burnout and resentment.
So it's about recognizing that those low motivation days are just part of the journey and finding ways to navigate them effectively.
Exactly. It's about being strategic with our energy and recognizing that sometimes the most productive thing we can do is rest and recharge.
This whole conversation is really making me rethink my relationship with motivation. It's less about forcing it and more about understanding it, wouldn't you say?
I couldn't agree more. It's about finding a sustainable rhythm that honors both our ambition and our limitations.
Speaking of limitations, let's talk about procrastination for a moment. Because, let's be honest, even with a low motivation day plan, there's always the temptation to just put things off entirely.
Procrastination, the age-old nemesis of productivity. But even this seemingly insurmountable foe can be tackled with the right strategies.
Okay, I'm ready for a battle plan.
Yeah.
How do we outsmart the procrastination monster?
One technique the blog post touches on is called time boxing, which involves allocating a specific amount of time to a particular task, even if you don't think you can finish it in that time frame.
Wait, so even if I'm dreading a task, I should just set a timer
Yeah.
and force myself to work on it for a specific period? That sounds a bit painful.
It might sound counterintuitive, but it can be surprisingly effective. By setting that time constraint, you create a sense of urgency and limit the opportunity for your mind to wander into procrastination territory.
So it's about tricking my brain into thinking it's a short sprint, not a marathon.
Exactly. And you'd be surprised how much you can accomplish in even a short burst of focused effort. Plus, once you get started, you often find that the task wasn't as daunting as you initially perceived it to be.
I can see that as like taking that first step is often the hardest part. But what about those times when even a short burst of effort feels impossible? Is there anything we can do to boost our willpower when it's running low?
The blog post actually suggests a technique called pre-commitment, which involves making a decision in advance that binds you to a specific course of action.
So it's like making a deal with yourself that you can't back out of.
Precisely. For example, you could tell a friend that you'll send them a draft of your presentation by a certain deadline, or even schedule a meeting with a colleague to discuss a project you've been putting off. By creating that external accountability, you make it much harder to procrastinate.
Ah, I see. It's like outsourcing your willpower to someone else. That's pretty clever.
Yeah. It's a powerful way to leverage social pressure to your advantage. And speaking of social support, another strategy the blog suggests is finding an accountability partner. This could be a friend, colleague, or even a coach who can help you stay on track and provide encouragement when motivation wanes.
So it's like having a cheerleader in your corner,
Mm.
reminding you why you're doing this and keeping you accountable.
Exactly. It's about building a support system that can help you navigate those inevitable dips in motivation and celebrate your wins along the way.
I'm really starting to see how these strategies can work together to create a more sustainable and fulfilling approach to productivity.
It's about shifting from a mindset of self-criticism and force to one of self-compassion and strategic planning.
And this brings us back to the blog post's final point, which is all about trusting your future self. But before we dive into that, we're going to take a quick break to hear a word from our sponsors.
And we are back and ready to tackle this final piece of the low motivation puzzle. Trusting our future selves. It's a concept that's both intriguing and honestly a little bit terrifying. I understand the apprehension. It requires a certain level of surrender, doesn't it? Letting go of that need to micromanage every aspect of our lives.
Exactly. It's like saying, hey, future me, I know you're going to have some rough days, but I believe you'll handle them with grace and maybe even a little bit of badassery.
That's a fantastic way to frame it, and it speaks to the core of what the blog post is advocating for, cultivating a sense of self-compassion and trust in our own capabilities.
Okay, but what if my past self has a history of, shall we say, less than stellar decision-making?
Mm-hmm.
On those low motivation days, how do I build that trust when there's evidence to the contrary?
That's where the power of mindfulness comes in. Instead of dwelling on past missteps, focus on the present moment and the choices you're making right now to set your future self up for success.
So it's about shifting my focus from what I've done wrong in the past to what I can do right in the present.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that every moment is an opportunity for a fresh start. And by consistently making choices that align with your goals and values, you start to build a track record of trustworthiness with yourself.
I like that it's like building a positive feedback loop. The more I trust myself, the more likely I am to make choices that reinforce that trust, and so on.
Exactly. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And over time, that trust becomes a powerful foundation for navigating those inevitable dips in motivation.
Okay, so let's say I've created my low motivation day plan. I've set up some accountability measures, and I'm working on building that trust with my future self. Is there anything else I can do to make those low energy days feel less, well,
That's a great question. And it speaks to the importance of finding joy and meaning, even in those less than ideal moments. One strategy the blog post suggests is reframing your perspective on what constitutes a productive day.
So instead of measuring my worth by how many tasks I check off my list, it's about finding value in other ways.
Exactly. It could be about nurturing your relationships, engaging in creative pursuits, or simply taking time for rest and rejuvenation.
It's like giving myself permission to prioritize well-being over achievement, even for just a day. That's a radical concept in our go, go, go culture.
It is radical and it's essential for sustainable success. Remember, true productivity isn't about pushing ourselves to the limit every single day. It's about finding a rhythm that allows us to thrive over the long term.
So it's less about being a productivity machine and more about being a human being with all our messy, imperfect, and wonderfully complex needs.
Beautifully said. It's about embracing the full spectrum of human experience, from those high-energy mountain-moving days to those low-key, soul-nurturing ones.
You know, this whole conversation has really shifted my perspective on low motivation days. They don't seem like the enemy anymore. It's more like they're just a different type of opportunity waiting to be explored.
That's a wonderful insight. And it speaks to the transformative power of simply reframing our perspective.
So for our listeners who are ready to embrace those low motivation days with a little more grace and a lot less guilt, what's the one key takeaway you'd leave them with?
Remember, you are not defined by your energy levels. Your worthiness is not contingent on your productivity. Give yourself permission to recharge and reconnect with what truly matters.
And trust that your future self will thank you for it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into conquering low motivation days. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and a renewed sense of hope that even those tough days can be navigated with a little bit of strategy and a whole lot of self-love. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep being kind to yourself always.